Glamis Castle in Angus is said to be the most haunted castle in the country. One of these apparitions is said to be Lady Janet Douglas, who was burned at the stake on 17th July 1537 on the orders of James V, who revisits her ancestral home to this day. Within the square tower of the original castle is a room where many guests have slept. One of these was a lady called Miss Bond. She had stayed there when a young woman, and although her friends told her the castle was haunted, she didn't believe them. She arrived with her mother and sister, but asked to sleep in a bedroom in the square tower, as she'd heard of a secret chamber within it. It was at 11 o'clock that evening her maid finally left her alone. She sat wrapped in a dressing gown, then opened the window. The night was still, and she could smell the honeysuckle and heard an owl hooting in nearby woods and a dog barking. The room was comfortable, with relatively modern furniture, and no thoughts of ghostly goings-on entered her mind. She took off her dressing gown and got into bed and was soon fast asleep. Then she found herself in an oddly shaped room with a high ceiling and a window set far back on a black oak floor, which was inaccessible from within. The walls were covered with heavy tapestries, and a phosphorescent light made its way through the window panes. The furniture had changed too, more like that of a cell than a bedroom. There was only a coarse deal table, a straw mattress, a kind of trough, but no chair. The air was thick and heavy, with a feeling of gloom and horror. After a time, something moved, and an icy chill ran through her body. Soon the shape revealed itself. Crooked human legs, a hunched body, long spidery arms with crooked knotted fingers, and a head covered in a tangle of grey hair. The face was white, staring, with a malevolent expression. The creature stretched, then lay on the floor, rolling onto its back. The door handle to the bedroom turned, and someone entered. Then there was a loud cry. At that point the girl woke up, and all she could hear was screaming emanating from the whole tower, the walls and the rafters, like someone, or something, in great distress. She sat up, horrified and terrified at the same time, and by her reasoning, the sound could only be associated with the creature in her dream. On another occasion at Glamis, possibly the same year, another young lady stayed at the castle. She said that once she left after her week's stay, she had turned from a sceptic about mysterious goings-on to a believer. The lady in question had been born in Edinburgh, but had spent much of her childhood in India. It was a late autumnal day when she arrived at Glamis. A blizzard had whipped up, and she couldn't remember such a ferocious storm. When she arrived, a crowd of anxious faces waited for her. By this time she was frozen, but the huge fires in the castle soon warmed her up. She too stayed in a bedroom in the square tower, and like Miss Bond, had heard the stories. By the time she went to bed at 11:30, the blizzard was worse, and her window rattled, so she placed a comb at the frame to stop it from shaking. She didn't know why, but she checked in the wardrobe and under her bed, then placed the candlestick and matches on the bedside table. Soon the lady was in a deep sleep, exhausted by her travels. At some point she was woken up with a start, as she was sure she'd heard a noise, but everything was silent. Even the storm had abated. But a feeling of fear slowly spread over her, although she couldn't understand why. She lifted her head off the pillows and listened. At first, she couldn't hear anything. Then she heard a noise, low and distinct, but where it was coming from, she couldn't pinpoint. Then the sound changed, and it sounded like footsteps rushing up the long stairs at the end of her corridor. She lay there frozen, then heard what sounded like swords clanging and the fighting and panting of men. It sounded like someone being pursued, and the man running away stopped right outside her door, trying to catch his breath. The pursuer reached him, struck him a blow, and the man crashed against her door so hard that she saw the oak panels shake. The sword came down on the man again, and she heard a cry, then a gurgling sound emanating from the wounded man. She then heard a battle axe slice through the man's helmet into his skull. A moment later she heard the man fall, the sound of his armour clanking as he slipped to the ground with a thud. The perpetrator stood quietly, as though wondering what to do next, when she noticed a dark liquid slowly ease across her bedroom floor from the door towards her shoes. At this point she shrieked, and in the next moment the door opened slowly and she fainted. Nothing further happened to her until the evening before she left, when the towering shadowy frame of a man in armour fell across her face. When she looked up, the visor was open, and what stared back at her was the face of the dead. It bent lower, and as she gazed at it, threw up her hands to ward it off. At that point, the maid opened the door to inform her tea was ready, and the apparition vanished. There are at least 2 ghosts roaming Glamis. One is Jack the Runner. In the 17th century, during the slave trade, it became popular to have a black servant in the mansions of the upper classes. At Glamis, the Earl was gifted a young black man named Jack by a plantation owner who had interests in the Caribbean. The guest was treated to a grand lunch, where they drank fine wines and listened to the plantation owner's stories. The idea of a hunt arose, but none had been organised, so it was suggested that Jack be hunted. This was what happened. The dogs were set on him, and the nobleman watched, laughing as he ran around the gardens, fighting for his life. They also had lances which they drew as Jack passed them. This went on for hours until the poor lad had no energy left and was killed by the dogs. Jack the Runner, as he became known, still runs round Glamis, his shrieks and cries of pain and anguish still heard to this day. Another ghost is that of a black page boy who was brought to Glamis as a child, where he was trained as a domestic servant. He was a gift to Lady Glamis from a plantation owner, and she was delighted with her new page boy. She, however, expected too much from the child. He was supposed to wait for long periods of time for her to dress or when she was talking at length with someone, but he would become distracted, as any little boy would do. He would go and explore the gardens or chase birds. Lady Glamis became frustrated by his actions, and one day she told him he must learn to sit still. She ordered him to sit on a stone step in the corner of a room and to stay quiet until she told him otherwise. He did just that. She went about her daily business, but forgot to go back and check on him. Days later, she suddenly remembered about the little boy, but thought he'd probably gone to bed. When she discovered he wasn't there, she went to the room, where she found him dead. He'd died from the cold. It's said visitors to that room often trip up as though he's running about, and the room is always cold. Another strange event at Glamis happened to an older woman who'd driven to the castle one day to visit her cousin, who worked for the Earl and Countess in the 19th century. Having heard of the hauntings, she was curious to visit the square tower. Her cousin told her she could go anywhere she liked, but she wasn't to go into what was called Bluebeard's chamber, a room which only 3 people knew about, so the chances of her finding it were slim. The tower was not what she expected. The walls were intact, the rooms bright and airy, filled with modern furniture, and there were no dungeons. One day her cousin was called away, so she had the castle to herself, so did a bit of exploring. She walked round, examining a finely furnished apartment on the top floor. When crossing the room, she bumped into something. She looked down but could see nothing, so stretched out her hands. She could feel a cask or barrel lying horizontally on its side. But when she looked, there was nothing to be seen. She gave the barrel a kick, then cried out, hurting her foot. She bent down and touched the invisible barrel again. Then, as reality set in, she fled the room. As she ran down the stairs, she could hear the barrel bump, 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 rolling down the stairs behind her. At the foot of the staircase, she met her cousin as she'd returned and clung on to her as the barrel continued past the pair until she could no longer hear it. Her cousin spoke. "Quick, quick," she said. "Don't for heaven's sake look round. Worse has yet to come." Grabbing her by the arm, she pulled the woman out of the tower, and as soon as they were outside, the maid stated, "That was no barrel. I saw it. I have seen it before." She went on, "Whenever it appears, a certain thing happens shortly afterwards." She also told the woman to never speak of it. The woman died not long after this, having spoken about what she'd seen. There is another version of this story. The barrel was said to sit at the top of one of the main staircases in the castle, and every time a new maid started work, the day would come when she would have to clean these stairs. Every time she reached the middle of the staircase, she would hear a creaking and rattling before the barrel was toppled over and pushed down the stairs towards her. The maid would then run to get out of its way and to safety, but when she turned round, it was back sitting in its original place. Another legend of Glamis Castle concerns a room of skeletons. In Forfarshire many years ago, the Lindsays and Ogilvies fought each other frequently, feuding over land among other things. One day, it happened that the Lindsays burned the homes of the Ogilvies, who by this time had little money left to fight with. So all the heads of the Ogilvie families got together and made their way to Glamis. The Earl of Glamis felt no loyalty to either side and was becoming frustrated with their quarrelling. They begged him for shelter until the Lindsays left, so he granted them it. They were taken to a room in the castle, where the Earl told them they'd be safe, but after locking the door behind them, the Earl tossed the key down a well and told his men to build a wall in front of the door. This was duly done, and the men perished in that room of starvation, where it's said their skeletons remain to this day. Another story attached to Glamis was one that happened to Mr. Vance. This gentleman was staying at an inn on the Strathmore estate when one day he happened to walk in the grounds of the castle while the family were away. The only person he encountered was who he thought was the gardener, and struck up a conversation. He asked if the man had ever found any fossils, to which the man replied he didn't know what they were. Once informed, he said no, but went on, "If you give me your word to say nothing about it, I'll show you something I once dug up over yonder by the square tower." The man led the gentleman to his cottage, which sat in some dark woods nearby, and to his astonishment, the gardener showed Vance the skeletal remains of a hand, with abnormally large knuckles, and the first joint much shorter than the others. Vance offered the man money to buy the hand, but the gardener refused. He told him he could have it for free, but that he mustn't look at it late at night or just before getting into bed. "If you do," he said, "you may have bad dreams." Vance, a Cockney, was not superstitious, and told the man that, then left, bidding him a good morning. That day was spent thinking about the hand, and at bedtime he was still looking at it, intrigued by its strange formation. Around midnight he decided to turn in, but when sitting on the chair he caught a glimpse of his door being opened in the mirror, but he was sure he'd closed it and bolted it. He turned round, and sure enough it was closed. He looked at the mirror again, and the door was open. He leaned forward to look in the mirror more closely when he gave a start. On the threshold of the doorway was a black shadow. Still looking in the mirror, it moved slowly across the room, but he could think of nothing in the room that looked remotely like it. A feeling of uneasiness swept over him, then terror. "Look here," he said aloud, more to himself than anyone or anything else. "If this goes on any longer, I shall begin to think I am going mad. I have had enough of magic mirrors for one night. It's high time I got into bed." However, as he tried to get out of the chair, he couldn't. He was held in place by an unknown entity. Then the blur changed shape and became the hand. It was no longer a skeleton, but covered with green mouldering flesh, making its way towards him. Now he was terrified. It moved up him, touching him on the shoulder, neck and head with its slimy skin, and pressed down on him, trying to suffocate him. He saw this all in the mirror. Suddenly he jumped from the chair. The room was now devoid of furniture, and in fact he wasn't even in the bedroom, but in a bare room with a slit for a window near the ceiling. He then saw the form on a mattress that hadn't been there initially, and with his small knife in his hand, approached the creature. He lifted the knife high and plunged it into it. The next thing he knew, he was back in his room at the inn, but the skeleton hand had disappeared. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see his own reflection, but that of the gardener, with his red hair, hawk-like features, and high cheekbones, and as the eyes met his, they smiled devilishly. The next morning he set out for the cottage to see the gardener, but neither were found, and no one he spoke to knew what he was talking about. Months later, he visited an art gallery in Edinburgh and was stopped in his tracks. On the wall hung a portrait of a gentleman wearing old-fashioned clothes, but the face seemed familiar, with its red hair and hawk-like features. In another story associated with Glamis is one about the child of Lady Charlotte Bowes-Lyon, who gave birth to her firstborn, a son, on 21st October 1821. Although little Thomas was healthy, he was physically disfigured, and his parents felt that he was so disfigured that he could not be heir to the earldom, so announced that their baby boy had died at birth. This perplexed the midwife, but these things happen, she thought. Thomas was brought up by a few who knew the secret, in a room hidden deep in the castle. He was short, with a barrel-shaped body and twisted limbs, but he was a bright boy. Lord and Lady Glamis went on to have more children, but as it seemed Thomas was going to live a long life, his father thought it best to inform his second son about his brother. On the night of his 21st birthday, the Earl took him aside, told him about Thomas, then took him to meet him. This changed the once carefree young man forever. One night his wife asked him what had caused this change, but he wouldn't reveal the secret, and just told her that if she knew, she would never find happiness again. The only other person who knew of Thomas's existence was the factor for the Earl. He spent time with him, and when he finished work, would take food to him, and took him for walks around the balconies of the castle, but only after dark. Occasionally, servants would see the mysterious figure. The factor would never stay overnight in the castle with him. In the 1860s, work was being carried out when one of the workmen opened a door at the end of the corridor, only to be met with two eyes. He spoke to the man in charge of the works, but was met by silence. The Earl then spoke to him and offered to pay his passage to Australia. Only many years later was that part of the castle opened up to guests, probably long after Thomas had died. His family always referred to Thomas as the monster. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.